Oh, that's a problem. Let's Well, hello everybody, it's me. Just testing some stuff out. That's all I'm doing. I'm going to read you something, see how the sound is. Onkelos' Vayikra by Drazin and Wagner says, and I quote, Abraham ibn Ezra, in his commentary to Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, states that the Torah was given to Moses' generation in a manner and language that they could understand. This generation of erstwhile, which means former, so former slaves, had primitive notions about many things. And human nature being what it is, there was no way to magically transform them. Thus, the Torah addresses the moral and spiritual behavior and development of the individual and society from the perspective of their somewhat primitive needs and understandings, but did so in a way that encouraged them to understand that the Torah was teaching that there was a higher level of behavior that they must develop. Wow. So from Father Abraham to Moshe, Jews were little more than Neanderthals who would grab women by the hair, drag them into their caves, have sex with them, and for some reason, those women would stay with the Jewish slug from that point on. Further, if the Jewish man didn't molest his own children, his sons did to keep human civilization going. This brutish, uneducated, unrefined man or men had no understanding of civility, manners, or culture, and because of the inbreeding, they lived like wild animals. Picking back up with Drazin and Wagner. Now, this is not their opinion. They're giving the opinion of Ibn Ezra and Maimon. So keep that in mind. Thus, for example, they said, although the Bible allowed slavery, it phrased its laws carefully to help the people understand that every individual is created in the divine image. All humans come from the same Adam, and slaves must be treated humanely. This biblical goal was achieved. The Talmud teaches that he who acquires a slave is actually acquiring a master. And ultimately, because of the way the Torah taught its laws, slavery was abolished. It is the same with this chapter of Leviticus, speaking of chapter 20, which addresses additional practices that are totally inconsistent with the concept of holiness that is the general theme of this section of the Torah. Whoa, so God okayed slavery for the dumb Jews, knowing that later on some smart Jews would come along, disregard God's apparent okay of slavery by manipulating Bible verses concerning holiness. And remember, the Talmud teaches that he who acquires a slave is actually acquiring a master. Don't worry about the fact that these words make no sense at all. They sound deep, and that's good enough for us dummies. They went on. The Talmud teaches that the penalties were instituted as an educational tool and that a multitude of jurisdictional constraints were established to make sure that the death penalty, which was a mere threat, would not be carried out. So these smart Jews were way smarter than God. For example, they say, circumstantial evidence was unacceptable, and two witnesses who saw the deed must testify. Furthermore, the culprit had to be warned before the crime that if he committed it, he faced the death penalty, and a person was not allowed to testify against himself. So God was just bluffing. He didn't really mean what he said. He was actually a bully and a liar. No worries, though. The smart Jews wrote better laws and kept us dumb Jews alive. I guess that's when us dummies started getting smarter too. Or are we still dummies in need of the smart Jews to help us figure it all out? Maybe so. Maybe that's why we still spend most of our time studying what the smart Jews said about the Torah and other stuff, and almost none of our time studying the actual Hebrew Torah. They went on and said, Moses Maimonides also focused on the primitive nature of the early Israelites and the need to educate them. He wrote in his Guide of the Perplexed in chapter 3, verse 32, that the Torah laws were formulated in a way that took notice of the general development of people and society. It is impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to another. It is, according to the nature of man, impossible for him suddenly to discontinue everything to which he has been accustomed. Maimonides states that the Torah must consider the customs that were in those days general among men. Thus, for example, even though God, according to Maimonides, did not want the Israelites to offer sacrifices, it was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God, as displayed not only here, but in the whole creation, that he did not command us to give up and discontinue this manner of service. In the same manner, God refrained from prescribing what the people by their nature, or by their natural disposition, I should say, would be incapable of obeying. When they did, why then didn't God simply change the nature of the Israelites so that he could give them enlightened laws that they could understand? Maimonides explains that the nature of man is never changed by way of miracles. God could do so, but he has chosen instead to let the world function according to the laws of nature. Thus, there was no way to teach the Israelites of several millennia past other than through laws that they could understand, and to fashion the laws so that they could lead the Israelites to a higher level of behavior and understanding. So, the same sages who taught us that God created everything also claim now that some things are not created, they are natural. In other words, they are self-created. Further, the same sages who taught us that God never changes the nature of man by miracles miraculously changed Pharaoh's nature by hardening his heart. Or did my mom forget that? Obviously, it couldn't be that the Torah was formulated to develop God's law and thus holiness in his people over time, because it is, in fact, the best way for man to learn. Couldn't be that. No, it had to be because we needed to develop our social skills over thousands of years. So, was the development of the sages built from the gradual development of the animalistic Jews as well? Or was it the work of the super smart sages that helped the super ignorant Jews to begin their gradual development? I would think they would say it was the latter. The Torah tells us that God designed and then created everything. How then is their nature? What naturally designed, created, and then perfected itself? Can you answer me that, Maimon? Further, where did nature get the materials needed such that it could somehow naturally exist? Is Maimon actually suggesting that God could not give us a Torah that is holy, just, and pure? Is he suggesting that God could not and therefore did not give us a Torah with the laws and instructions to those laws according to absolute truth and purity from the beginning? Yes, that's, I think, what he's saying. The Torah tells us that man was created in the image of God. Was Maimon actually suggesting that God was a Neanderthal? Is he suggesting that God was forced to be a tyrant, making threats of death until we could grow out of our barbarism and become refined with the new holy laws given to us via the brilliance of our sages? Yeah, that's exactly what he's saying. Maimon and the rest of the sages are, in fact, suggesting that the oral tradition is superior to the words of God. They actually believe that their reshaping of God's law via the oral tradition was the actual plan of God for the Jews from the beginning. Maimon and the others may not have been thinking in these terms, but this is exactly what they were suggesting. Picking back up with what the Onkelos said, education aside, in view of the somewhat culturally primitive nature of the Israelites of Moses' generation, as seen by even Ezra and Maimonides, it was necessary to deter the newly formed nation from improper behavior by imposing harsh punishments. The Torah, for example, wanted the Israelites to embrace a sexual moral code that weaned them away from the perverse and degrading cultural and ethical influences of Egypt and the nations they would encounter in the desert and in Canaan. And that would instead enhance the integrity of the individual and the family. This all pervasive, virtually worldwide depravity could only be deterred and eradicated by imposing harsh penalties on violators of the law. Yet, as we wrote earlier, the Torah was written in such a manner that the Jews ultimately came to understand what constituted proper behavior, so that these harsh educational and deterrent punishments became unnecessary. It is easy to talk down and find fault in people when you have 20/20 hindsight. It is easy to say, I would have been like Moshe and would never have made a golden cow for the people to worship. I wouldn't have complained about the lack of meat. I would have been happy with the manna. I wouldn't have doubted God. I would have lived in awe of God with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night and a big old rock following us around, providing us water. I would have been all inspired. Where are the historical accusations of the Jews being sexual predators or like the Egyptians or any other barbaric culture? Where does the Torah say that the Jews were engaging in these behaviors? Oh, yes, there are no such accusations, except, of course, by the sages who lived thousands of years ago. The arguments of the sages are that God had to dumb down the Torah for those low IQ simpleton, barely above animalistic behaving peoples. But don't worry, God knew that the time would come when refined, well-educated, extremely sophisticated Jews like the sages would be able to see through the archaic, unjust, unholy law that God gave at Sinai and give us an oral law and Talmud that would lead us uncivilized Jews to a higher consciousness, appreciation for, and superior knowledge of that which God really meant by the Torah. Does that about sum up what the sages believed? Well, in their defense, they did not have the past 100 years of current times, of major archaeological finds like the Dead Sea Scrolls. They did not have a computer. They could not go online and connect to the libraries of major universities around the globe and download almost an endless number of books in PDF format. They could not search databases with thousands of research papers and doctorate dissertations spanning hundreds of biblically based disciplines. With that in mind, I would never say the only thing more gargantuan than their hubris was their colossal lack of knowledge. I would never say that. So let's see if we can clear a couple of issues here before we work our way through chapter 20, which I've already done. We know from a number of sources from the Second Temple period that the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular, that many Jews found fault in the Sanhedrin because they refused to kill people who had committed crimes against the Torah. The Sanhedrin was seen by the Jews as weak, feckless, and disobedient to God's law. By the first century CE, the vast majority of the Jewish world had become so Hellenized that their understanding of the biblical text had become very literal. We also know, especially because of the New Testament letters, that the sect of Judaism to which Yeshua and his followers belonged were not literal in their interpretation of the biblical text. Thus, the old way of thinking and applying the Torah was harshly clashing against the Hellenized literal approach to understanding and application. The clash between the old way of thinking and the new literal way is actually quite easy to explain. The old way of thinking, being idiomatic, is the key. When the Hebrew text says, die he, die they, that's literal English for yumot, it is not saying that someone should actually be put to death physically. It is a Hebrew idiom that is equivalent to our modern idea of excommunication. Idiomatically, there is no greater death than for someone to be separated from their family, friends, people, and homeland. To be stoned is to have shame and offense chiseled into a stone. No one was to physically die. An eye for an eye and sayings like it are to be understood as the punishment must fit the crime. This is important because first-degree murder can be punishable by death, while involuntary manslaughter cannot. Shalom v'shalom, everyone.